Kemi Badenoch had two chances to attack the government today. First at Prime Minister's questions and then again in response to the budget. The Tory leader used her first bite of the cherry to try to frame the budget as part of a wider government chaos. The attack started strongly enough, but the line of march became ragged and she ran out of steam halfway through. At PMQ, she opened with a flourish, saluting the many farmers who have come to Westminster today to protest at the shameful attack on them in last year's budget, before branding this the most chaotic lead-up to a budget in living memory, with resignations, hostile briefings and leaks galore. When Lindsay Hoyle rebuked noisy Labour backbenchers by telling them if they didn't want the budget, they should say so now, Badenoch pounced with a neat aside that nobody wants this budget. She then tried to anchor the exchange in economic credibility, challenging Keir Starmer to respond to Andy Haldane's warning that Labour's fiscal fandango had helped to flatten the economy. Starmer replied with the inevitable refrain about the biggest shambles in living history, the Liz Truss budget, gleefully reminding the House that Badenoch once called that package 100% right. It was a sharp rhetorical and political jab, but also a tellingly low bar. The new government only has to look less deranged than Truss. When Starmer started complaining that he was still being asked about the budget 20 minutes before it was due to be delivered, Badenoch had a fair point that she was in fact asking about the bungled run-up, the resignations, the mixed briefings, and as it turned out, the budget watchdog's catastrophic leak. She broadened her attack to the internal warfare around Wes Streeting, pressing Starmer to repeat on the floor of the House that none of his advisers had briefed against Cabinet colleagues. His exasperated reply that no one in number 10 has briefed against Cabinet ministers gave her one of her better moments, a brisk joke about Morgan McSweeney investigating Morgan McSweeney and finding that Morgan McSweeney had done nothing wrong. Starmer countered that while she was scrolling through Twitter, the government was tackling the cost of living. So far, so lively. Then the focus started to drift. Badenoch veered off into a tangent about Angela Rayner being brought back into government because Starmer was desperate to shore up his crumbling leadership. It was meant to paint him as weak, but it blurred the central charge about economic chaos and the OBR leak. She tried to haul it back with a social media-ready in-summary list of Labour failures, culminating in the line, "When will he finally accept that the chaos starts and ends with him?" It was a decent clip, but you could feel the initial force of the argument dissipating. By the end of PMQs, the structure had frayed, the punch was less than the sum of the jabs. Her budget reply had the same problem in longer form. Badenoch branded the statement a total humiliation for Rachel Reeves, insisting there is no growth and no plan after Labour hiked taxes, extended the freeze on income tax thresholds and scrapped the two-child benefit cap. She had some solid material. Reeves has now delivered roughly £68 billion of tax rises across her first two budgets, largely via the long freeze in income tax and national insurance thresholds, which will drag millions more into higher bands by 2030 to 31. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has already said this clearly breaches Labour's manifesto promise not to increase national insurance, and the Resolution Foundation calculates that the latest 3-year extension to the freeze will cost a typical worker on £35,000 around £1,400 in 2030 to 31. On that terrain alone, Badenoch's argument that this is a stealth raid on working people is not mere rhetoric. She also leaned into the internal Labour unease that Reeves is writing the leaflets for Reform UK, putting up taxes while boosting some welfare spending, lifting the two-child cap and announcing a new property levy on homes over £2 million, all in the context of weaker growth forecasts and higher welfare pressures. Some Labour MPs have already warned that this combination risks alienating working-class voters who feel overtaxed, underserved, and Badenoch tried to weaponise that fear. But again, the longer she spoke, the less disciplined the attack became. What began as a forensic charge of manifesto breaking and stealth taxation slid into an unstuffed rant about Benefit Street, Christmas sweets, Laurel and Hardy gags, and dog laughing at the Chancellor imagery. The central lethal point that Reeves had shredded her own no tax rises on working people pledge, while presiding over the highest tax burden in modern times, and the threshold freezes will push the number of higher rate taxpayers above 10 million this decade, got buried under the avalanche of lines. By the time she reached the peroration accusing Reeves of cowardice, spinelessness, and incompetence, the emotional temperature was high, but the analytic sharpness had faded. In both outings, then, Badenoch showed she can land blows and find a good line, especially on the manifesto breach and the OBR leak, but she also showed a tendency to overtalk her case, wander off the main charge, and exhaust the audience before she exhausts her material. Today she proved she can get through the big set pieces without collapsing. She has not yet proved that she can sustain a disciplined prime ministerial argument from first sentence to last. That after a year in the job, week after week, twiddling around with bits of paper and not really getting to grips with it. After a year, you would think that somebody who practices every single week would know how to deliver a speech of some length. Badenoch can't. Badenoch isn't capable of it. Badenoch has tried and failed. Today we saw her, scoring a fairly acceptable B-. But you expect slightly more from the leader of the opposition, don't you? Expect slightly more from somebody who has been practicing and practicing. If you practice this much for a year, you expect some sort of virtuosity, and Badenoch has none. She showed us signs that she could actually do something, but it's not enough to sustain interest. After a year, I expect a better performance.